Welcome to Uncertain Things. Is that how I start?
No, not really.
Hey, Vanessa.
Hi, Dom.
Welcome to Uncertain Things. We are doing an in-person interview. Look at us with Adam Louis-Klein.
Hello. I'm very happy to be here.
We are here to talk about Adam's, what is it? Is it penchant, research, fascination, obsession with the world of anti-Zionism and its origins? But we were just here chatting in our Astoria apartments about our beloved neighbor, Zohran Mamdani, beloved neighbor and soon to be Emperor of New York, Zohran Mamdani. Brother Zohran. And I was wondering if we want to bring some of this topical conversation to the record. Adam, you've lived in the city for a while now. You're on the outskirts watching it burn. How do you feel about the imminent rise of Brother Zohran?
Yeah, I think it's extremely foreboding. Of course, we're seeing anti-Zionism being normalized in the political mainstream. We're seeing basically something that looks like what's already happened in many places across the world, but that's never really talked about because we only tell the history of anti-Semitism and classical anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and we don't talk about Soviet anti-Zionism and all the Jews that were purged, that were deported, and that were executed because of an anti-Zionist regime. We don't talk about the Jews who were kicked out of Arab countries like the Farhud in Iraq. And so we are now potentially seeing that whole ideological complex, which is a real thing, coming to the West. And that, I think, is Mamdani's politics, and it's extremely dangerous.
But, let's keep touching grass, right? Mamdani is talking about free buses, not a Juden-free city, right? He's not going to commit or stand at the front line of a Farhud type riot, is he? This is not what you're afraid of. You're not imagining him being the harbinger of those scenes from 20th century Arab countries where Jews were like rounded up by the local populations while the government look the other way.
Yeah, I mean, so let's compare it, right? Like we have the example of Soviet anti-Zionism, right? It didn't always look like that. There weren't pogroms, right? It was more of a kind of state-sanctioned operation where they would shut down, Jewish cultural centers. They did ban Hebrew. They would shut down synagogues, and they would often use anti-Zionism as a pretext. So they crushed Jewish life at that cultural level, right? But then when we look at sort of Islamic anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, obviously we've seen events like the Farhud that are much more violent. Now, what we're witnessing in the West is a kind of fusion of these two anti-Zionisms. Like people talk about the red-green alliance, right? Like the left and Islamism are becoming a single force. And obviously Soviet anti-Zionism was inspired by its attempt to ally with the Arab states, especially after 1967. So there's always been that connection. But I think since October 7th, we've seen this kind of breakthrough of even violent Islamism into the West and into the left. We see these red triangles where Jews are being marked for death, right? And so there's an explicit, physically violent element to his politics as well.
We don't know marked for death. We know marked as a threat, right? We want to let's keep the language to be as precise as possible. We it's not like we have seen lynch mobs, quite literal lynch mobs so far. There have been some violent attacks, but there's also been the violent attack of crazed pro-Zionist attacking that Palestinian family I think it was in the Midwest. I don't remember exactly where. So, those are heated times, and crazy people take advantage of these to opportunistically lash out on whoever the perceived enemy is. And especially this is a very violent time in American politics in general, even if you take out the Zionist question. So looking specifically at this behavior of Zohran Mamdani, he's not exhibiting the classic signs of an Islamist politician as you might see in Western Europe today, where the thrust of his politics is about bringing a more conservative Islamist mindset to the local Western politics. Zohran seems to be generally appreciative of the liberal tendencies of the West. He seems to be pro-LGBTQ. He seems to be very pluralistic when it comes to other religions. He has been endorsed by many trans rabbis. So clearly there is a wide tent for him in New York politics. So it's not exactly the sort of Islamist threat that you might see, let's say, in parts of England these days, or in parts of France. So what is it that you diagnose about him that realistically worries you?
I agree with that analysis. So you're right. He's not posing as a kind of explicit conservative Islamist preacher who wants to immediately impose Sharia law. I sincerely doubt that he is going to impose Sharia law after he wins. What he's doing is he's giving the left front for Islamism and trying to continually legitimize Islamism as an oppressed identity position. So he develops many alliances with Islamists who have associations with jihadism and terrorism. And then when he is criticized for that, he talks about Islamophobia, right? And now Islamophobia is very real, but he is playing a very specific politics where he knows that he's inverting Jewish victimhood, right? So you'll notice that he always moves to Islamophobia right when there's a kind of scandal about his anti-Semitism, and he makes it very dramatic. So the first time there was a big scandal about his anti-Semitism, he sort of, on TV, he started crying about how he was a victim of Islamophobia. And then this most recent time, after it was discovered that he had this relationship with the imam who was supportive of the World Trade Center attacks, he made this very public, dramatic, long speech about what it's like to be a Muslim.
To have been a Muslim in the immediate aftermath of 9/11.
Right. So it's very much a weaponized victim politics. And there's a kind of, I think there's a kind of Orwellian disturbing inversion going on, because exactly what anti-Zionists tell Jews today is that we are weaponizing anti-Semitism, that there's a kind of global power structure built around Jewish victimhood and the Holocaust, where we always make ourselves the victims, but we're actually sort of fake victims, because we're as Zionists, we are evil oppressors, right? And so we use our victimhood in a cynical and manipulative way. But so I think there's a really dark inversion here, because I see him actually doing that. And there's an inversion when you treat a minority group like the Jews as if they are a global power structure of fake victimhood, where you treat Muslims who are a minority in the US and are discriminated against as a minority, but globally are a hegemonic majoritarian force as somehow the image of the world's oppressed. There's something very wrong there.
But aren't we just participating now in sort of a victimhood Olympics between Jews and Muslims?
No, I think we just need to be specific about the kinds of victimhood that do exist.
Right. So I think now this is where it gets into the interesting nuance, because I've always cringed away from accusing anything of anti-Semitism, and I believe the Jewish hate is obviously existed, obviously is part of the Western DNA, but at the same time I was always uncomfortable worrying about it too much, and certainly not focusing my identity or public activity around the question of discerning who is or isn't anti-Semitic. I remember in 2019 when Ilhan Omar came to American prominence, there was a lot of conversation with our friends, with Vanessa's husband, for instance, about whether or not what she's doing crosses the line of anti-Semitic. And for me, it was, sure, some of the things that she said, like it's all about the Benjamins, that was an anti-Semitic trope, probably absorbed through an anti-Semitic upbringing. Do I care about this? Am I worried that the Jews are going to be rounded up? Not really. But there's something different that is happening after October 7th in terms of the organization around an aspect of Jewish political existence. And I think this is the thing that we should be zeroing in on. It is not it's not merely the general spirit of anti-Semitism that is manifesting, and we can bring in Dara Horn to discuss how core it is to the literary identity of the West and how it is emerging now again. What exactly is anti-Semitism in this regard? But in a very immediate way, what Zohran is representing, and I think this is why this is different to me than just mere occasional discrimination against a minority ethnic group, is the fact that the very existence of Jewish political and national aspirations is being treated as anathema by the left. And that is anti-Zionism. It is to say that you are not allowed to practice your national identity, which for me, as a Zionist, rabid Zionist Jew, is who I am. This is my entire, both literally my national identity, but also my philosophy in seeing the relationship between Judaism and the land of Israel. That's just what it is. It is one and the same. And to say that that aspect of your identity is illegitimate. You're allowed to be a Jew. You're even allowed to be a trans rabbi if you support Zohran, but you are not allowed to practice Judaism as you understand it. That political expression is verboten. So to me, this is the sinister, subtle aspect of what Zohran represents, as differentiated from the more rabid, overt anti-Semitism of some parts of Islamized Western Europe.
I want to hear your response to that, but I'll just quickly put in my 2 cents about Mamdani. So I'm less concerned about what will happen in New York and more concerned about our national politics, right? Like the fact that he can get elected in one of the most Jewish places in the world.
The second most Jewish place in the world.
Yeah, it's opening up a permission structure to practice anti-Semitism more broadly in our politics. Like what you were saying about normalization, like that's my biggest concern.
Right. I mean, I think what both of you are saying is really right on. So the issue since October 7th is that anti-Jewish ideologies have become a means of political mobilization, and they've become kind of a cultural zeitgeist through which the world is understood. And I mean, this is really a central feature of anti-Judaism, of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, all three, that you see across history. That the Jew or the Zionist or Israel is constructed as a symbol of everything that's wrong according to the values of the time. So Israel today is a scapegoat. It's basically been symbolically recoded by everything that today's world treats as evil. Racism, colonialism, and genocide, right? So the colonizer apartheid and genocide libels. And so people use Israel as a kind of projection screen to express their frustration with the world as such. And that is mobilizing people. And it obscures that Jews are a minority. So an interesting thing, if you talk to anti-Zionists, they often have this kind of cognitive dissonance where like sometimes they want to kind of pretend they're concerned with Jews as a vulnerable minority. And sometimes you see Mamdani, he's forced to kind of go to a synagogue and talk to the people there and sort of engage with their concerns as if they're, a real minority. And other times Jews are kind of just elevated into this global power structure. And that dissonance is the dissonance between, reality and fantasy, basically.
I do think there might be something to bring up here in what you were talking about earlier with the difference between the global scale versus the national scale and majority and minority, because even though Jewish people are a minority in the US, there's a tremendous cultural influence and a sense of maybe familiarity. And maybe I'm biased because I grew up in New York, and maybe that is only true to a New York East Coast upbringing. But it's like almost easy to forget that Jews are a minority because we hear Jewish ideas or hear Jewish voices in Hollywood and whatever it might be. And so there's almost this like that dissonance that you're talking about. I think it's there is a forgetting that they are a minority sometimes, and a lack of ability to zoom out.
Right. I mean, I think that has to do with the success of Jewish assimilation, right? That since, let's say World War II, Jews have had a very successful story of assimilation into the United States, whether that's in, cultural or economic success, relatively speaking, and sort of integration in the surrounding society. And from that, you got these kind of left anti-Zionist theories that Jews have become white, that Jews are not real minorities. They're not really oppressed.
I have heard that from people that it's hard for them to understand that Jewish people could be oppressed because they're white, or at least the ones that they know are white.
Right, and that shows a certain misunderstanding of Jewish identity and a misunderstanding of how the cycle of libels against Jews kind of works, because it works through these kind of momentary hysterias, really, that society goes into a kind of trance almost, where society is repeating and transmitting these libels from person to person. Each person is getting more and more outraged, like we saw with the genocide libel. And it's spreading as a contagion, getting more and more mainstream and getting people more angry and violent. And then when these libels are kind of done, when things kind of subside, it's almost like society has a kind of amnesia about what it just did, right? And I think the Holocaust was like that too. It's kind of hard for a lot of people today to even realize how that was possible or what that even was. But we're living through a libel cycle. So since October 7th, the genocide libel, which is a false claim that's been basically falsified and disproven by over 500 scholars of the Scholars for Truth about Genocide. But the media, of course, did not report that because they were participating in this libel cycle. They were attempting to make the genocide libel seem more true than it was. Ezra Klein on the New York Times, he regularly has token Jews on who come and legitimize the libel, who explain how, now we need to move beyond the Holocaust, and they make a kind of cosmic, symbolic story about it. We are living through a mass hysteria, really. And when it's over, society might sort of forget what it did. And I really think that we need to not forget, actually. So those of us who have seen what has happened, with sober eyes, need to, continue telling the story. When the New York Times exploited a medically ill child on its cover, right, to make it seem like Israel was intentionally starving people, like, we can't forget that. When they claimed that Israel bombed the Al-Ali hospital and it wasn't true, and they haven't really apologized for that. We can't forget that, because in the future, that'll help us fight, further iterations of sort of libel-based reporting.
Like you can be anti-war, right? You can be anti the war in Israel. You can sympathize with what's going on with starvation that is happening with people that are the casualties of this war. And I just want to underscore that that's different from what I believe, from what you're talking about, right? Like that there are legitimate things that you can complain about what Israel is doing in this war, which doesn't necessarily, but it's hard because it's like there's so much conflated that I guess it's kind of hard to feel like you can say anything at all in terms of critique, because you're worried about slipping into these tropes or slipping into anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. So how do you feel about that? Like, how does one appropriately critique what's happening while still being respectful of the misrepresentations that are happening?
It's very difficult. And I think that anti-Zionism since October 7th really destroyed sort of the conditions to even have a sensible discussion about the war in Gaza. And it destroyed even the possibility of, evaluating what was happening. Because if you look at the anti-Zionist claims about the war in Gaza, they're based on a kind of pre-existing assumption and a sort of, they frame the war such that Hamas doesn't exist. Right. And this isn't just about making excuses for Hamas, making excuses for terrorism, Islamism. It's actually a way of selecting facts to confirm your original premises. Because, right, if Hamas doesn't exist, everything Israel does just looks like completely wanton destruction, right? So you can't really argue with someone who has those premises. And that's a broader point, I think, about anti-Zionism in general. They start out with an understanding that Israel's inherently genocidal, and then they look for selective and confirmatory evidence to prove it. So it's not in the space of falsification or reason. And so you can't even debate them. And so, yeah, we are in this kind of, there's like a screen between us and them. Right? We live in these kind of distinct worlds. They've tried to recode reality itself. Obviously, there are still sources of information where you can sort of understand what actually happened, but it's not going to be in discussion, I think, with the people right now who are posing as so-called critics of Israel.
I also want to draw our listeners, if we have any listeners who are conflicted about this issue, which I actually know we do have some, I want to draw them back to some of the initial recordings we had immediately in the aftermath of October 7th, and the few podcasts that we had before that were specifically about Israel. I think our first interview with Eli Lake, which was right at the rise of Ben Gvir, when we had Neil Ferguson on. It was during the 2021 conflagration in Gaza.
Walter Russell Mead.
Well, yeah, Walter Russell Mead. That's true. In all these conversations, if you follow my thread, there has been, at the same time, a lot of vehement criticism of aspects of the Israeli government. Some of them I may have modified on and may have been even gotten stauncher on, and things have changed. But I've always stated very clearly what aspects of the Israeli government I criticize and why. And yet, this is in direct contrast to the immediate reaction, the immediate anti-Israel reaction that emerged on October 8th, a day after the worst pogrom of Jews.
Before anything.
Before a single Israeli soldier entered the Gaza Strip in reaction. Well, Israeli soldiers were barely able to contain the attack in Israel. And the reaction was by the DSA, the home party or home caucus of our beloved brother Zohran. Their immediate reaction was to accuse Israel of a genocide on the day of October 8th. That just to validate what Adam is saying, that this is not just a post-factum battle of narratives. And also, if you go back to what I said at the time, I've laid out exactly how I anticipate this to happen based on the understanding of the logic of Hamas. And the understanding was that they are waiting for the opportunity for Israel to overreact. They are trying to provoke an overreaction because that is and always has been the logic of terrorism. Putting aside Islamism, putting aside the additional death cult value of Hamas, it is always in the nature of terrorism to provoke the enemy to overreact. And in the two-pronged attack on Israel, which was to commit the most atrocious slaughter on camera, on live TikTok, and spread it around the world, and to in order to get the Israeli blood boiling or the fear roiling, and to kidnap 300 civilians, not just civilians, but 300 people, many of them, if not the majority of them, civilians. That was the impossible trap that put Israel in the inevitable situation where it can't really commit full assault on Gaza in order to directly target Hamas, because Hamas is hiding behind Israeli civilians, not Gazan civilian as well, but also literally Israeli civilians. So it has to drag its feet through a much more convoluted war. And at the same time, Israel cannot let this slide and just say, fine, we'll just trade on day one, because Hamas on October 9th says, okay, we're done. We're ready to have some prisoner trade now. And Israel can't just let it slide, given the horror that just transpired. Israel can't afford to do that to its own people, let alone to some either higher moral sense of international justice, if such thing exists. So with that logic, Israel has to respond harshly, but also has to drag itself, because it needs to think very carefully on every move that it commits in order to try to protect its own civilians that are being kept in tunnels. That scenario and I've said that on October 8th, on the episodes that we released then, made it impossible for Israel to ensured that Israel is going to act in such a way that Hamas will exploit to tell its narrative about Israeli brutality. And you see the whole Zionist project is corrupt to begin with. This is nothing to do with our actions. This is the true nature of the Israeli regime. You commit that in contrast to the moral torture that Israelis have been putting themselves over the past 30, 40 years about their relationship to the Palestinians, their relationship to the Arab world, constantly self-questioning and self-battling over their place in the Middle East. And in a way that seeks reconciliation, craves reconciliation. You take the past 40 years of course, there are some Israelis that do not want reconciliation. There are the Ben-Gvirs, there are the Smotriches, always exist. There were always a minority in Israeli society. You take the past 40 years of Israeli behavioral pattern and you compare it to what Hamas did, and you cannot tell the story that Israel is genocidal. You cannot tell the story that Israel sought this imperialistic project of eradicating Gaza. All of this is nonsense, and as Adam is saying, is libelous. And all you need to do is actually track real history, which exists. And this is why the occasional caveats of saying, everything that Adam, Vanessa, you were suggesting that what Adam is saying, just to be clear, it doesn't negate the harm and pain of Palestinians. Of course it doesn't. Because human life is sacred. Human life is important. But war is also important when you're fighting for your own, existence. And this is not an existential threat in the sense that Hamas was really on the verge of toppling the Knesset, but it is an existential threat in the sense that to allow this genocidal organization to metastasize and cross the border at will with the endorsement of Western leftists without proper response would have signed the death warrant for Israel.
Right. And the whole analysis you just did is one based in moral complexity and in the fact that there are different actors that are constrained in situations, and Israel only had so many options available to it, right? And then it chose to act, within those options, right? But that is not the framework that anti-Zionists use against Israel. They essentially have a kind of theological understanding that basically Israel is a Jewish majority state. They say it was founded on settler colonialism, meaning that an alien population arrives, and since they wanted to establish themselves as a majority, they had to eliminate the Palestinians, and part of that happened in the Nakba with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. This is also a narrative that's highly selective and confirmatory. So when you tell this narrative, for example, you have to assume that the early Zionists basically always wanted to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, that there was some kind of master plan. And if you read the anti-Zionist literature, they're very intent often on trying to prove some kind of, like Elon Papp or what's his name, Nur Masala, they kind of really want to show that there's an evil master plan. And that is really, a typically anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic kind of construction, that the Jew has some kind of malevolent intention there from the beginning. And so there's no reason to sort of analyze, the constraints under which Israel would be in. What you want is to find sort of confirmatory evidence for your assumption that everything Israel does just is malevolent. Right. But if you look at their analysis, right, it doesn't actually have much explanatory power. Right. A lot of these people are kind of academics or leftists or whatever. They think they're kind of doing some structural analysis of the world. Right. But it just comes down to these evil Zionists. Right. They want to colonize. They want to kick out Palestinians. They want to kill, right? And so it's not really a rational discourse. It's a kind of mystification that happens when people have lost their mores. They've lost their grounding in rationally analyzing events.
What is then anti-Zionism? And how do we avoid the trap of getting locked into the language game of is anti-Zionism equivalent to anti-Semitism, is equivalent to criticism of Israel, is equivalent to etc. Because this is the loop, right? And saying, you're saying that we can't criticize Israel, which, needless to say, if you've listened to the podcast or forget about the podcast. If you've listened to Israeli discourse, no Israeli has ever spared criticism of Israel. So no, nobody's saying that. And I would argue that any time that somebody says I can't criticize Israel, this person is being disingenuous, because of course you can. So, but you see already, even in trying to avoid this trap, I'm falling into this trap.
The entire debate that you just set up there, that we are stuck in as a public, as Jews, or
as English speakers,
as English speakers, is based on extremely faulty assumptions. So first of all, the two terms you've tried to put next to each other, they sound similar. The words sound similar, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. They're being used in very different ways. So today when we talk about anti-Semitism, it's a kind of moral absolute that we associate it with the Holocaust, with the Nazis. To be an anti-Semite is basically to be evil, right? And it really just refers to a hatred, right? When we say anti-Semitism, we don't actually think about an articulated ideology, but anti-Semitism actually emerged with Wilhelm Marr in 1879 with his book, The Conquest of Germany by Judaism. And he really developed a political ideology, and people self-identified as anti-Semites.
Let's be clear, he was actually trying to separate his version of anti-Semitism, his view of criticizing the Jewish race, from the brute hatred of the Catholic world of Jews. It says this is not a spiritual boogeyman. This is not just the old blood libels. No, this is a true modern, enlightened, scientific study of Jews as a race. And when measured as a race, we find some, structural problems in the way that this race interfaces with ours.
Right, and the analogy to what's happened today with anti-Zionism just could not be more clear. And more people need to understand this, right? So in Wilhelm Marr's time, religion increasingly looked like something old and primitive and barbaric, and the new values of the time were science and scientific progress and nationalism. So he recoded the hatred of Jews into something that looked scientific, that was based on race.
Progressive.
That was progressive. And so it seemed legitimate. And anti-Zionism today has just done the exact same thing. But we struggle to see that when we only compare anti-Zionism as a political ideology to anti-Semitism as a hate, instead of seeing three different anti-Jewish ideologies that emerged in sequence and evolved. There was the medieval anti-Judaism, which was an ideology about Jews as religion, about the Talmud, etc., and killing Christ. Then there was anti-Semitism, or classical anti-Semitism, which was about Jews as a race infiltrating nation states and elaborating a kind of financial conspiracy to rule the world. Now we are in the third stage. I think we can say that since October 7th, anti-Jewish hate has mutated completely. And so I think that we should stop asking about whether anti-Zionism crosses the line into anti-Semitism and just recognize anti-Zionism as its own form of anti-Jewish hate.
I'm not sure that everything has muted into anti-Zionism. I would say that much of the old anti-Semitism has dissipated because I think racial discourse is generally dissipating. And, one of the most prominent white supremacists of the moment, Nick Fuentes, is arguably not fully white and doesn't really care about traditional racism. So if anything, there was a bit of a defaulting back to Talmudic magic, panic, and medieval Jew hatred on one side and anti-Zionism on the other. It's just the middle ground, the Hitlerian, from Marr to Hitler through Chamberlain. That thread is mostly dissolved. I think the only place that it still has some grip is probably the Muslim world, but for the most part, we're seeing medieval Jewish hate and the anti-Zionism threads. If you disagree, you have a skeptical squint.
So I think that whenever there's a new form of anti-Jewish hate, the old forms stick around, and an explosion of the new form gives an opportunity and permission for the old ones to come back. So the scholar of anti-Semitism, David Nuremberg, described it as like a snowball. Basically, so as it's rolling forward, it's just accumulating all the stuff from the past. So if you look in like the pages of Der Stürmer during the Nazis, they reprised all the...
Der Stürmer was the Nazi daily magazine.
Right. They reprised all of the old libels. They had medieval images of the Judensau, which is like a depiction of Jews sucking from a pig that was very common in the Middle Ages. They had the Jews killing a Christian child. So they reprised that stuff. So classical anti-Semitism gave them the opportunity to reprise these sort of more primitive forms, right? And anti-Zionism today, which is very, advanced. Like if you read these sort of anti-Zionist scholars, right? Like it's very abstract, right? And you wouldn't necessarily know from reading some of it that this is necessarily anti-Semitic, right? Like it's, they use this very kind of metaphysical logic about a Jewish majority state that I was talking about. It seems like it's some kind of sociological critique. But when anti-Zionism becomes normalized, it gives a permission structure.
Well, I would argue that much of sociology is metaphysics, but that's perhaps a different discussion.
I do want to understand more, because I feel like I have some friends who I think would identify as anti-Zionist, and they would vehemently disagree that they are anti-Semitic. I think in their minds, when they say I'm anti-Zionist, they're saying I'm anti-colonialist. Like I'm anti the colonial. That's how I'm understanding it, because I've even had interactions where I've like someone has been like, "You're a Zionist," like as if it's a dirty word, and I honestly think it is. The interpretation of it as a meaning like the colonialist project incarnate or something. I don't even know to what extent they understand the Jewishness implied in it. I don't know. It's like a transmogrification.
This is the discussion, and we're prepared because this is where you're going to dive in. I think this was a great setup. I just want to point out that the very fact that you said this is the colonial project incarnate, I feel like is the point. Why is this particular case of a group that identifies as whose entire culture belongs to this place, living in that place, is viewed as the incarnation of colonialism, which is arguably captured by Portuguese sailing across the ocean to take over Brazil, right, and steal their gold, right? The fact that these are equivalent, and somehow it is Jewish tradition that for 2,000 years have been saying every year, next year in Jerusalem, whose entire identity is being kicked out of their homeland, that is the colonial project incarnate. And incarnate, the fact that this is somehow this perfected incarnation of this ultimate evil that we hate, that is, I think, the metaphysics that Adam is alluding to.
Yeah. So basically what they've done is they tried to recode all these terms so that their meaning will shift, but then they'll seem as if they're plausibly applied to Israel. So let me give you an example of how they do this with colonialism.
Who's they also in this case?
Anti-Zionists.
Yeah. Anti-Zionist intelligentsia.
The intelligentsia, exactly. It was really the anti-Zionist scholars who did this. So the big way they do this, obviously, is through settler colonialism, right? And this theory called settler colonialism, it didn't become mainstream in academia until like 2011. So you have anti-Zionists all the time telling you Israel's a settler colonial state, or they're even pushing this in Amnesty International or the Journal of Genocide Research, as if this is kind of some unbeatable argument to prove that Israel is genocidal, because all settler colonial states are inherently genocidal. But this is actually such a recent theory, so they shouldn't demand that we all somehow agree or find it to be intuitive. But basically the idea is that they saw that Israel wasn't based on economic exploitation where there's a metropole. There wasn't a big empire like in England or France that then sent out people to go and, like you said, mine gold and bring back, wealth. There was nothing like that. So actually it doesn't look like colonialism. So they invented this new concept of settler colonialism. And what's so weird about this is it's kind of a word game, right? Because when you put the settler there, it's actually the opposite of colonialism. So settler colonialism Zionism is when there are people who go and build a community in a place, they don't exploit the labor. They say, we don't want your labor. We actually will only use our own labor and just have our own little community here. And that's obviously what the Zionists did, especially in like the second Aliyah, where they had the kibush avodah, and they would only use Hebrew labor.
Aliyah, by the way, this is another subtle point. Like Aliyah is the Hebrew word. I'm sure assuming Vanessa doesn't know, even though I always assume that she knows Hebrew. Aliyah is, colloquially would be translated into the migration. There are several stages of migration into Israel from Europe and Arab lands, wherever Jews were, really. But the word itself means rising to ascend. And it comes specifically from the Jewish metaphor it's not a metaphor, the Jewish tradition of ascending to the Temple Mount 3 times a year. That's where, like, originally the pilgrimages were from all across Israel to Jerusalem for the high holidays and for Passover and Shavuot. That's where this picture, this image of you ascend to your holy land, you ascend to your holy places, because Jerusalem is on top of what you might call a mountain. I think by American standards, it's a hill, but still, this is ascending. That imagery of ascending to Israel is deeply rooted in Jewish identity, because 2,000 years, 3,000 years before that, when the Jewish community was thriving in its holy land, it was ascending, pilgrimaging to the temple.
Right. And in general, of course, they're erasing that whole element of return, that this was a movement of indigenous return, and that Jews are quite obviously indigenous with our connection to the land, and our, ritual cycles, as you were mentioning, that are rooted literally in the seasons of the land of Israel. But what they've done then is to put these two words, settler and colonialism, together so that the settler part is colonial, but actually colonial means you exploit other people's labor, and settler means you don't. So settler, it means you're not colonial. But then you put it with colonialism and say it's its own form of colonialism. So what they're trying to do is change the meaning of words, whose meaning is open, but maintain their moral stain.
It's not just the exploitation of other labor. The point of colonialism is the relationship to the metropole, as you were saying. That is why it's a colony. It's a colony of a metropole. The American colonies were related back to London and until they declared independence. But the idea was, until that point, that they are not independent settlements, that they are colonies of a faraway metropole. The Zionist project was the exact opposite, was to disconnect from their diaspora, to disconnect from the countries where they were always seen as foreigners, in order to return and settle their indigenous homeland. That was Zionism. That is all that Zionism means and has ever meant. So the anti-Zionists who tell that story as colonialism incarnate, I don't care if you come by this idea innocently by being a moron, and I think if you use terms that you don't understand, despite available material, you're a moron, or by more sinister pathways, it doesn't really change the fact that what you're doing is perpetuating a libel.
100%. And it's the same with the term apartheid or genocide. Like, it's not coincidental that these words are all terms of art, so that no one knows exactly what they mean, right? They're not super ordinary English words, colonizer, apartheid, genocide, but they all sound really, really bad. They all have really, really morally abhorrent implications. So the key then is to try and make Israel, an object of stigma by spreading these libels and redefining the terms.
I want to draw one exception. The term apartheid, I think you're absolutely right that, like genocide, like colonialism, those are terms that are being used on Israel in a manipulative way that not only is inapplicable, also devalues the actual cases of genocide, of colonialism. With the case of apartheid, I think it almost still entirely applies the criticism. But there is a layer where it sticks better because the relationship of Israel to the West Bank specifically, not to Gaza, but the way that the relation between Israel and the West Bank is which is the reality of the occupation, and the occupation is the correct term for what's happening there. It's a legally defined occupation, military occupation. That particular case does have a problem. That has a real problem that anybody from Israel who is, even Netanyahu would probably admit is a problem. And anybody who is certainly left of Netanyahu, but Netanyahu himself would also understands that this is a problem, that we have a military rule that applies slightly unequal law on the Arab population than on the Jewish settler population.
So where I just push back on that is I think that you're coming in good faith.
Right. That's exactly the difference.
And want to have an accurate description of a complex situation. But I think what apartheid really is doing in anti-Zionist discourse, apartheid is fully bound up with the concept of racism, right? The South African apartheid system was a system created by racists, by people who believed that the other population was inferior and so should be subordinated and segregated for that reason. So when we talk about apartheid in the case of Israel, it's connected to the whole Zionism is racism libel that the Soviet Union pushed through the UN in
the 70s.
Yeah, in 1975. And that was just a huge part of their anti-Zionist propaganda, which was a way, of course, to invert Holocaust memory and invert the experience of Jews as victims of racism, as victims of genocide, in order to attack Jews while pretending that one wasn't doing so. So that inversion with the displacement from Jews to Zionists, I think is kind of the key structure through which anti-Zionism sort of legitimizes itself.
That is absolutely correct. But I do want to make it clear that, and well, I'll say one more thing about this in a second, but coming at it in good faith, which is not what my enemies do, and it is not what the anti-Zionists do in general, there is a problem. There is a problem of unequal law. It is not about racism, even though obviously there are many racist Israelis, there are many racist Arabs. Racism exists in all culture, and ethnic bigotry is a real thing, and it does guide behavior. But primarily the problem of a partial legal system in the occupied territories is a real problem. And I actually just this week, I had a conversation at dinner with a Palestinian activist in the West Bank who lives in Hebron, who is in his 40s or 50s, I think, and he is incredibly smart, incredibly sharp, understands Palestinian society deeply, understands Israeli society quite deeply. And he genuinely, sincerely said, when we had this conversation, that he would rather see, now there's talk about annexing the West Bank. He would rather see the West Bank annexed by Israel than the continuation of the current occupation system, because at least if it's annexed, even if Palestinians don't immediately get integrated into the voting system, they're not even, because this is usually how these things happen. You don't immediately integrate your enemy into your voting system. Even then, they will at least answer to the same law as the settlers, and that will be an improvement. Not only that, he might even prefer that than seeing complete independent rule over the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority, which is corrupt and violent. So not out of any love to the Jewish state, he said, I might prefer being a non-voting resident of Israel annexed within the West Bank in Hebron than the perpetuation of the current occupation system. So this is just for our listeners who are looking for somewhat more uncertain views of the situation. This is where there is a real complexity. But in order to actually have the conversation of this real complexity, you need, as Adam pointed out, good faith interlocutors, which is not what anti-Zionism is.
Right. And I also want to point to the term occupation, because I think this term is also far more complex. And when you're talking about Israel, all these different condemnations of Israel, they can shift between sort of the kind of analysis you're doing, which is grounded in fact, and one that's sort of mixed up with a lot of anti-Jewish symbolism. So if you look at the term occupation, if you look at that term in Islamist literature, like Sayyid Qutb or bin Laden, right?
Sayyid Qutb, just for context, is the author of, I think I mentioned him in my conversation with Jonah Goldberg a couple of months ago. He is the author of Modern Islamism and the Muslim Brotherhood. He is. We might get more deeply into him, but he's quite a guy. He's the guy who went to spend some time in America, saw some jazz, saw some flappers, and got so horrified by the debauchery of American society that he called for the total reclamation of retrograde troglodyte Islamism and its violent application on the Western world.
Right. And so when they use the term occupation, it's grounded in a specific theology. And obviously, they don't think just the West Bank is, so to speak, occupied. And there are legal issues around that. Like, it's not actually so clear legally that the West Bank is occupied, because prior to the 1967, it was Jordan who had control over the West Bank. They illegally annexed it. And then later on, they basically gave up their title to the West Bank. So it's not clear who actually owns the West Bank under international law. It was earmarked during the Oslo Accords as part of an eventual Palestinian state, but then obviously the Oslo Accords fell apart. So it is kind of disputed territory. Obviously, the so-called international community says it's occupied, and they just sort of determine the law a lot of the time.
But in some ways, it's also important to understand that to recognize that Israel is treating it as occupied territory in the sense that it is applying military rule to most of the West Bank.
Right. So, well, Area C was always under Israeli jurisdiction.
Occupation. It's not civilian occupation yet.
Okay, you are right about that. Let's just stay on the Islamic issue, because they've always seen the whole area as occupied.
That's right.
Right. And so
I mean, let's be more accurate even. They see the entire state of Israel as occupied. This is from the river to the sea. Not 48 is the occupation, right? Not 67.
Exactly.
This is the real problem. The point is that there is, and we've been through this previously on the podcast, so if our listeners are tired of this explanation, I apologize. You can skip 30 seconds ahead. The occupation is an international law term that describes the military rule, an intermediate military rule over disputed territories when the previous sovereign has been vanquished in a war. And the purpose of an occupation is to reach either independence of the local population, or for it to be ceded back to the previous sovereign, or to be annexed. But occupation is always an intermediary rule that follows warfare before the territory that changed hands between sovereigns gets decided upon. That is what occupation means, and in that sense, the West Bank is still occupied territory, even the A territories, because the Palestinian Authority is hardly an independent sovereign at this point, and is very much subjected to Israeli military control.
Right. The question is just if it's occupied Palestinian territory, because right. Jordan was the sovereign before that.
Right. And in that sense, this is why it's weird, because there's not been for you to be an occupied territory, you need to have a previously existing sovereign, and the Palestinian state has never existed, the Arab Palestinian state. In that sense, yes, it is weird, murky water, but when we come down to the fundamental spirit of the law, it's clear that based on the idea of self-determination, Israel should, seek to accommodate the inevitable independence of some kind of Arab national aspirations in these territories, whether they call themselves Palestinian, Jordanian, or whatever tribal affinity they might bring up. that much is fine. The problem is who's going to rule what and how do you get security guarantees? And this has always been the fundamental issue. There has been an unwillingness also on the Palestinian side to actually have a clear sovereign, the declaration of who is going to be the sovereign under these circumstances, because this ambiguity, the current existing ambiguity, serves some political interests very well. Be it Mahmoud Abbas, who runs the Palestinian Authority, who is very happy to be like in bed with the IDF and just have his corrupt power over the 8 territories, or Hamas, who actually wants Palestinians to exist in an immiserated state so that they can justify their more genocidal aspirations to destroy the entire Zionist project.
Right, because for them, the entire Zionist project is occupation, because what occupation just means is the presence of non-Muslims in the land with sovereignty, or in lands that they're just not allowed to be in at all. So Islamist literature often describes American military bases in Saudi Arabia as an occupation of Saudi Arabia, because non-Muslims are not supposed to be in that land. And this land is Dar al-Islam, and the land of Israel is also considered to be Dar al-Islam. That means non-Muslims must be dhimmis. They must be basically subordinated to Muslim rule and then sort of tolerated to practice their religion under certain restrictions, paying a special tax, etc. So the Islamist position from the beginning is that the entire region is occupied. And so I think that's very important to understand. And that notion of occupation filters into the radical anti-Zionist understanding of occupation as well, and also of settlers. So settlers are basically seen as this inherently alien population that does not have rights in this land. So something that presents itself as progressive, because it constructs a group as, white European colonizers who are doing the things that we all think are evil now, is actually, from this kind of inverse perspective, itself a kind of conquest ideology and xenophobia actually to Jews in the land of Israel. So I think that's the going back to the Red-Green Alliance, within the Middle East, MENA anti-Zionism basically produces a more kind of directly anti-Semitic xenophobia, where Jews are these foreign conquerors. When you now are someone in the West, you can sort of take their perspective and view Jews as alien, but now you see Jews as colonizers, right? And who are sort of alien in that other land, but could be assimilating here.
Let's be MENA anti-Zionism.
Sorry, Middle East and North Africa.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's be as generous as possible to the Arab Muslim perspective. We're talking about a culture that has been under the thumb. I don't want to say boot because Mamdani says that the boots are laced by the IDF, which is, probably one of the most overtly anti-Semitic things that Mamdani has said. But under the thumb of European powers, the Arabs of the Middle East have been under the thumb of European powers for, half a century, and before that under Ottoman influence, imperialism for hundreds of years. And when they emerge at the end of the First World War as the spoils of imperialism start claiming independence or being granted independence by the magnanimity of their former masters, their former colonial masters, there is a real struggle in the Arab world to reconcile their rush to redraw their own borders. Again, there's not a lot of agency in drawing those borders. Most of them were drawn by Europe, but as they seek to at least make sense of the newly drawn borders and the newly drawn sovereignties, be it the Hashemites in Jordan, the Sauds, or whoever. But then you have this other narrative that is kind of clashing with their own aspirational independence, and that is the narrative of this dejected tribe that has, specifically at this point, European tribe, because the Arab countries have their own Jews, and those Jews at this point are not racing towards Zionism. It is European tribes who, propelled by pogroms and the Dreyfus affair and the looming Holocaust in Hitler, are rushing to fulfill their own story and their own aspirations, and they're migrating in large numbers into the territory of Palestine, right? And these Jews, and to be clear, there's been a continuous existence of Jews in the land of Palestine, in Jerusalem, and in other cities for thousands of years. My own family has been there for hundreds of years. So it's not but the majority of Jews do show up in these migrations. Those are the aliyahs that Adam mentioned. And from the Arab perspective, after hundreds of years of imperialist interference and decades of European interference, suddenly they see these foreigners coming in droves, telling they have their own story about themselves, but as far as the Arabs are, I'm not talking about the Arab falahs, the farmers. I'm talking about the political figures who are telling these stories. They don't care what stories the Jews tell themselves. They see foreigners coming in droves, being facilitated by the British governance, the British mandate. So there is a way we can understand why this seems like another attempted sabotage by European powers to, stick a thumb in the eye of Arab independence, rather than just those lowly Jews trying to seek independence.
Yeah, I understand that. I think it has to do with the way we tell the story of the Middle East. So today, the dominant story of the Middle East is told from an Arab and Muslim hegemonic perspective, in which the non-Muslim and non-Arab minorities, like Berbers or Maronites or Kurds or Assyrians or Jews, are sort of erased from the picture. So there's only one story. It's the Arab nationalist and Islamist anti-colonial story to kick out the West. But the history is actually much more complicated, because these different minorities were, like as I was saying, dhimmis. They often had restrictions. Well,
most of them were not even dhimmis, or even below dhimmis. Like the Jews were lucky to be dhimmis.
What's a dhimmi?
A dhimmi is the people of the book. So, in Dar al-Islam, the expansionist versions of Islamic rule, if you are conquered and are under the sovereignty of a Muslim ruler, you need to convert to Islam or die. Some cultures, primarily the people of the book, Jews and Christians, are allowed to maintain, because they are part of the lineage, they're seen as the primitive versions of Islam, the progenitors of Islam. They're allowed to maintain their primitive views on the hope that they will eventually convert to Islam, but as dhimmis. And dhimmis is basically a form of serfdom, where there are harsh restrictions in terms of what property you're not fully allowed to own property. You're not fully allowed to practice your faith publicly, and you have to very visibly pronounce your dhimmitude. And for Jews, they had to wear really ridiculous long hats in some places. They had to wear forms of the star. The star is a European thing, but they also had yellow patches that they had to mark themselves as Jews. They were not allowed to ride horses. They were not allowed to own weapons. They were third, fourth class citizens, and they had to pay special dhimmi taxes, which were just taxes for being Jewish.
Yeah, European colonialism, for example, when it penetrated into the Ottoman Empire, which was kind of decaying at the end of the 19th century, helped push these liberalizing reforms, the Tanzimat reforms, that actually gradually got rid of dhimmitude in many of these places. So European colonialism was, so to speak, a progressive force in much of the Middle East for many of these minorities. And I think we can see Zionism in that respect as well.
That's interesting. But to go back to your point, you were talking about how we've seen the world strictly through the Arab independence lens. the Middle East through
We've
the
actually
Arabic
been
Peninsula.
unable to see the diversity of the Middle East, of different minorities, and the left has shown no solidarity. For example, it showed no solidarity when the Druze were attacked by al-Jolani's forces in Syria. Obviously, it shows no solidarity with Jews. It hasn't really showed much solidarity with the Maronite struggle in Lebanon. So when the Maronites came into conflict with the Palestinians, obviously they supported largely the PLO, right? So the narrative that the left today tells about the Middle East is actually an imperial and colonial narrative. And in many ways, they have it upside down. And I think this is because after the end of the Cold War, the left was basically looking for a new anti-imperial agent. So they had basically always tacitly at least aligned with the Soviet Union or China, etc. And then when communism no longer had that power because the Soviet Union fell, obviously China still exists doing its own thing, but has liberalized its market in many ways. They looked for a new revolutionary actor, which was just defined oppositionally to the West. And that's how I think the left has come into alliance with Islamism.
Because my understanding is that, in the 60s, let's say, there was a natural alliance between the left and Israel, right? There was like an understanding of Israel as like the little guy. And so there was a feeling of like, well, we as the left, a party that stands up for, oppressed peoples everywhere is pro-Israel. But obviously that has shifted today. So where is that?
And also, mind you, Israel was largely socialist at the time, which made
that
it
makes
easier.
sense then. So, but when does it start to flip? Then you're saying it's the
It's in 1967 is really the watershed moment when Israel wins that war.
That's the 6-Day War.
The 6-Day War in 1967. Yeah. Israel wins against a number of different Arab armies that converge on Israel at once. The defeat of the Arab armies is seen as a huge humiliation to the Arabs, and the Soviet Union begins a really aggressive international anti-Zionist propaganda campaign. So that is where most of the stuff that anti-Zionists say today, it comes from Soviet propaganda, and they just have no idea.
Well, it's important to note that part of the reason that the narrative changes for the Soviet Union is because until that point, the West didn't really fully align with Israel. The idea that Israel and the U.S. have this special relationship is Kennedy onwards, not before. So during and also not necessarily after entirely. Nixon had a very complicated relationship with Israel in the 70s, and Eisenhower certainly had no interest in supporting Israel. There was the relationship of the U.S. with the fledgling state, the fledgling Jewish state, was very rocky. And in terms of its military support, at first Israel depended more on the Soviet Union, then a little bit on France, then a little bit on England. It was really uncertain, and there was a lot of self-reliance. It was only later, like down the line, that Israel becomes so closely associated with the U.S. And if you're looking at this from a geopolitical prism, this is the real movement that answers your question. The more that Israel becomes associated with the U.S., the more it becomes the enemy of the global left.
Mm. Yeah, and like for the boomer Jewish folks that I know, I think they feel kind of totally taken by surprise. I think that now when they interact with other generations, like they identify as lefty, and so then they if they're meeting with other generations of other lefty folks, they feel completely surprised that they are so anti-Israel. And even if it has been building, I guess it's been maybe a slow burn, or just maybe we weren't paying attention, or some of us weren't paying attention until now it's kind of become inescapable. But is this an October 7th phenomenon, or why is it now so obvious in a way that it wasn't, at least for me and a lot of people I know, like 5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, the whole relationship with the U.S. is very interesting because there's something that Hannah Arendt said. Sometimes anti-Zionists try to represent her as an anti-Zionist, but she wasn't. I mean, for those who don't know, she was a German Jewish philosopher and an intellectual who escaped Nazi Germany. She came to the U.S. and she was a professor at the New School, and she wrote about totalitarianism. But something she said about the creation of Israel was that she was concerned that Jews were doing something that Jews have done for a very long time, which is that as a vulnerable minority population who's often subject to violence from the majority, we've often sought out sort of the people in the highest positions of power, right, to protect us. So this dynamic kind of evolved where we would sort of rely on kings or elites to protect us from masses. So then that would protect us for a time, right, because the kings had the power to bring in the police, et cetera. But it also increases the resentment towards us because we're associated with power. So that's kind of the court Jew method of Jewish survival. And she was worried that in the creation of Israel, allying with, the United States eventually, or seeking out the approval of these sort of larger powers like the British Empire earlier, would sort of stoke this same kind of reaction or appearance that Jews are really close to the top of power and thus can be like an object of resentment and scapegoating. And so I think the left fundamentally does use this U.S.-Israeli relationship. To them, it's like a knockdown argument, right? Because the U.S. is the most powerful country, therefore the U.S. is bad. Anyone that's allied with the U.S. is bad. Of course, it's actually not really consistent because they don't use this argument with the Kurds, right? So the Kurds are also a kind of, indigenous Middle Eastern minority who have come into conflict with Islamism and jihadism. They were at war with ISIS, right? But the left was never as opposed to the Kurds as they were and are to Israel.
I mean, is this part of the military strength of Israel that it is so powerful and it's doing such a good job that it's kind of like a backfiring?
Yeah, I mean, that breaks the whole kind of narrative of grievance, right, where you're supposed to stay oppressed, you're supposed to stay weak, and it also...
And this is Dara Horn's...
Right.
People love dead Jews.
Right. I mean, I don't think all people love dead Jews. I think there's a lot of nice people who still don't hate us, and so we should not alienate them by saying that they love dead Jews.
But the love dead Jews, Dara Horn's point, we interviewed her before October 7th.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
That story, plays out with additional poignancy when you see how Anne Frank, for instance, is being hijacked for the Palestinian story. And you're talking about inversion. Those are two pieces to the Anne Frank wearing a keffiyeh. There is the inversion, or as my dear friend Chen says, that's the projection. And there is the people love dead Jews. The story of Anne Frank would not have been about resilience and victory and triumphant. It needs to be about hiding in a closet. That's how we like the Jew, hiding in the attic, waiting for the Nazis to pull you out and shoot you. We don't want the Jewess in Tarantino's alternative history of Inglourious Bastards burning all the Germans in a theater. We want the Jewess who is caught in the attic or in the basement hiding like a rat, and we want to cry sentimental tears about her. That's the story of Jews that we like. That's the Schindler's List that we love. We love the red-dressed girl who is found on top of the cart of corpses in the Holocaust. Oh, how awful. That is the never again that we care about. We don't give a shit about the Jews who've decided to take the never again story seriously, not trust their host countries and learn how to use guns themselves.
Right, and I think this goes to this element of inverse causality in the way that anti-Zionists tell the narrative of Israel, and it goes back to the apartheid libel too. So Israel's military keeps getting stronger and stronger. There's more and more security, etc. This appears to anti-Zionists when they erase that other actor, like they erase the Hamas actor in the Gaza war, and it makes it look like a genocide. If you do that, it ends up appearing that like Israel is an aggressor through a kind of optical illusion that you've imposed on what you're looking at, right? So, but like these security restrictions that Palestinians horribly have to live under are the result of actually increasing violence towards Israel. So I think that's part of the inversion as well. So you're inverting the cause of violence so that it always looks like Israel is the aggressor.
Right. And let's grant again, because we want to be better than our enemies. Let's grant that not all failed attempts at reconciliation and a better peace resolution in Israel are the result of Palestinian intransigency and recalcitrance, right? Like not all of it is the rise of militarism on the Palestinian side. Part of it is sabotage from the Israeli right wing, or like the story is complex when you're dealing with, as we said, good faith interlocutors.
Yeah, I'm not trying to present a logic of blame that makes Palestinians, blameworthy for everything. I'd rather see it more in terms of anti-Zionist violence itself. So I'd see the PLO or Hamas as agents of anti-Zionist violence. I'd see Nasser's Egypt as an agent of anti-Zionist violence, and I'd see the conflict as sort of driven endlessly by this anti-Zionist complex that sustains the notion that Israel is the fundamental evil in the world. We need to keep destroying Israel. We need to keep condemning Israel's self-defense. But these dynamics have also produced, obviously, dangerous responses in Israeli society, because a society that is constantly living under people trying to kill them all the time develops some, extreme, reactions.
And I would argue that Israeli society, because I don't love you've lived under certain hardships and you've developed a brutal version. You've turned into a brutal version of yourself. I don't like that, because I think that's a lot of the excuses that the left often uses to justify violence. And I don't like that. I don't accept this. For instance, I don't accept any kind of settler violence as being legitimized by October 7th. Which is like right now there's been an outburst of settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, and many of them feel justified, and some people in the Israeli government, namely the Ben Gvir faction, sees it as legitimized by the brutality of October 7th. In their mind, compared to the horrors of October 7th, what is burning a few olive trees in a Palestinian farm? Field, whatever. And I don't accept this. This is my total and utter and forevermore rejection of victim culture by anyone. I don't accept Palestinian victimhood. I don't accept Jewish victimhood. I accept resilience, and I accept developing strategies for survival. And I think that the IDF and the incredible military prowess of the Jewish state is not a response to victimhood. It is a strategy for survival and resilience. And that is the difference. Because when you're talking about a response to being cornered and being oppressed or being in a tight spot, then you're justifying lashing out. And the lash out should be legitimate no matter what. Even if, on an emotional level, you understand why the Palestinian who's grown up in Hebron under Israeli military occupation, even if they were not exposed at all at any point to UNRWA anti-Zionist propaganda, they would still probably develop a lot of hard feelings about the Israeli entity. Right? They would not love Israelis if the only Israelis they come into contact with are violent settlers and IDF soldiers, right? It just makes sense. Psychologically, I get it. Morally, that does not justify committing suicide bombing and killing other civilians. And similarly, nothing in the Jewish experience should justify any kind of brutality for its own sake.
Oh, I completely agree.
Right, I know you do. I just wanted to make it extra clear for any of
For
our...
the record.
I hope we have some anti-Zionist listeners that are still with us, and I hope they hear this point so they understand that nothing in Zionism should mean that, and it doesn't. The important thing is that the IDF is justified not out of resentment, not out of a lashing out for being cornered as a victim, but as a strategy for survival. Like the recognition that you are not going to trust other people to protect you, because they're not gonna. Because we could see that even Biden, who was a very Zionist president, was oscillating on how much Israel should be allowed to act for its own defense. We've seen all of Europe vacillating on how much should Israel be allowed to act for its own defense. And that is the logic of Israeli militarism, is the understanding of if I am not there for myself, who is going to be? And the answer, when you were talking about geopolitics, is no one. And by the way, this should be the logic for every nation in geopolitics in general. This is not uniquely Jewish. Nobody is ever going to be there for you geopolitically. Same with Ukraine. The president of the United States changes, and the willingness of the American public to support the justified Ukrainian war against morally repugnant Russian invasion has completely diminished. The combination of Trump being in office and the American left that a moment ago really cared about Ukraine now suddenly cares about Gaza more. Suddenly there is no more real appetite to support Ukraine, who is clearly being destroyed by a brutal dictator.
So obviously I agree.
There's never going to be anybody for you, is the bottom line. Nobody is ever going to give a shit about your little nation. Get armed, get an army, and defend yourself. That is the only fucking way in geopolitics. In other words, grow the fuck up. The idea that the international order is there to protect anybody, that there is this underlying humanity and kindness and moral logic to international law that is going to save you when the monsters come for you, is bullshit. You need to take care of yourself. So whether you're the Kurds or the Ukrainians or the Israelis, or for that matter, the Palestinians, you need to do what's right by you. The rest of the world isn't going to care about you. And the problem with the Palestinian system right now is that their entire logic is survival by attrition. The only strategy right now that Palestinian leadership, not the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian leadership as it is now, which is divided between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, both of them exist only by attrition, thinking that they're going to wear down Israel by terror attacks and by Western condemnation. And Israelis are not going to move. They're not going to budge. So the Palestinians who actually care about their lives and about their future prosperity should reach out now to moderate Israelis and make plans for a new Middle East. Do what Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are doing. Do an Abraham Accord with your immediate neighbors. Do what Egypt did. Do what Jordan has done. Do what Giuliani is trying to do potentially. But as long as they're going to be run by the dependency on the victimhood narrative that is being perpetuated by Hamas and by the Palestinian Authority, they are going to live an immiserated, miserable life because Israel is not going to fucking budge.
So what if instead we saw both peoples as victims of a larger complex? Right? Because then we could maybe transcend this way of thinking
together.
Right? Because it's true that the Palestinians have a kind of victimhood culture where they're constantly being oppressed by Israel. And on that basis, there is a kind of notion that you need to use violence to resist that oppression. And of course, there's an element of victimhood culture in Jewish and Israeli culture, which is, justified from our actual history of victimhood, including today with terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians.
Justified, but still should be rejected, I'd say. But yes, go on.
But if we saw that it wasn't Israel oppressing the Palestinians, right? And it wasn't all Palestinians who were to blame for the violence against Israelis, but it was a larger structure of anti-Zionism itself as a broader ideology. And this goes back to what we were saying before. When we look at anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, we often think of anti-Zionism as just kind of a cluster of opinions that someone has about Israel. And that's why you have this whole criticism of Israel thing. Like, is this opinion that I have about Israel anti-Semitic? Instead of looking at it that way, we should recognize anti-Zionism as basically a holistic ideology that's embedded in institutions. So like the UN, many NGOs and human rights organizations, now in academia, are basically taken over by anti-Zionism. So anti-Zionism is actually a kind of power structure.
Oh, I agree. I don't think that we're the victims of it. I think that the people who are being captured by it are captured by a delusion. And the delusion is that you're going to dissolve the Jewish state. That is it is a vicious, it is a sinister delusion, but it is a delusion. And to the extent that it is NGOs and the UN and Western players that are, and to that extent, Arab forces that are, or China or Russia, who are relying on anti-Zionism, it does benefit them. And it's a good business model because you're able to either raise money or galvanize political action based on this narrative. But as far as it actually applies to the Palestinians, it is a delusion because they are not going to get 48 being the founding of Israel. And if you look at the comments on October 8th and the River to the Sea people, they're all talking about not going back to 67, which is the occupied territories of the West Bank. They're talking about 48, which means the entire destruction of Israel, right? That's what anti-Zionism means. Anti-Zionism does not mean relinquish the occupied territories. Anti-Zionism means the destruction of the Jewish state, because Zionism means Jewish self-determination. Anti-Zionism means the rejection of Jewish self-determination. You do not get to have a state.
And one of the hinges, obviously, of the anti-Zionist complex, is, and that Wilf has talked about a lot, is the right of return, right? So the right of return, which is basically the notion that all the Palestinians who were driven out during Israel's War of Independence have a right to go back to Israel and thus change the demographic character of Israel from a Jewish majority state to an Arab majority state, right? That is a completely exceptionalized notion. There's no other refugee population in the world for which refugee status is indefinitely passed on. And as long as there's the belief in the right of return, there's no reason ever to compromise and have their own state.
And let's be very, very clear to our listeners who have not listened to our episode with Night Wilf, don't know her, or are not that versed with the region. What we're talking about, Palestinians at any point should be allowed to return to whatever is determined as the Palestinian state, in the same way that the Jewish state gets full control of its immigration system. There's no, the idea of the right of return, let's put aside the terminology that can muddy the conversation. Palestinians can migrate to the Palestinian state when there is a Palestinian state, in the same way that Jews or whoever is allowed to migrate to the Jewish state. The implication of the right of return, as discussed by Einat Wilf and hotly debated in peace negotiations, is the idea that Palestinian refugees should be allowed to return not to the Palestinian state, but to the Jewish state. And that is obviously whatever the Jewish state will be after the final borders are determined. And that is obviously bullshit and will never going to happen. And that goes back to my original point. This victimhood mentality, and it applies to, I would say, Jewish grievance, Palestinian grievance, any kind of grievance mentality leads to delusions. And the story of anti-Zionism is a delusional story that is useful for grifters in the West, i.e. leftists, or, Russo agents, anti-Western agents, whatever. And for Arab countries, for their own internal political logic, the people who are not benefiting from anti-Zionism are the Palestinians. The Palestinians suffer from anti-Zionism because for as long as this debate is waged as the battle between Zionism, being Jews have a right for their own self-determination in their ancestral land, and anti-Zionism, which says that they don't, then we're going to keep building more and more tanks and guns and rockets to ensure that the latter doesn't happen.
Right, and that is what's so messed up about the anti-Zionist complex, right? So it's created this group in perpetuity of victims, the Palestinians, who really are victims because the Arab countries didn't integrate the Palestinians into their own countries after 1948, and they are victims of...
And that's how you get a Palestinian majority country like Jordan that keeps its Palestinian majority as an oppressed ethnic group.
Right. So the Arab countries have used the Palestinians. They've exploited them to make Israel something perpetually impermanent, based on the same Dar al-Islam logic that a Jewish majority state cannot exist in Palestine. It has to be an Arab majority state. It has to be based on Arab sovereignty. So it's a colonial logic that's victimized another people and used those people as a kind of narrative of replacement or supersession. So like supersession in theology is the notion in Christianity and Islam that Jews were the chosen people. God was on the side of the Jews, but then Christianity came with Jesus. The Jews rejected Jesus, they were replaced, and so there's now a new chosen people, which is the church, and it's the same thing in Islam. The Jews refused to recognize Muhammad as the prophet, and the Jews lost their claim to be chosen, which also means in both religions, the Jews lost their rights to the land of Israel, which was originally promised to them. And so now these other empires, imperial religions like Christianity and Islam, have the right. And so what we've witnessed with anti-Zionism and the attempt to construct the Palestinians as this new victim, as this new ultimate victim that replaces the Jews right after the Holocaust, because there's also a whole Holocaust theology that reinscribes the Jews as the chosen people, as the absolute victims of absolute evil, the Nazis. And anti-Zionists have worked really, really hard to try and invert this. So Jews are now the ultimate perpetrators doing a genocide, and Palestinians take their place. And so that is all rooted in kind of a theological deep structure that's maintained in real institutions like UNRWA, like the right of return, and that is exploiting Palestinians. So I think that the left needs to see that anti-Zionism is an injustice, right? So obviously anti-Zionism recoded Israel as evil in the terms of progressivism and progressive justice, but anti-Zionism is the injustice. So I think maybe if leftists could see that, some of them could actually be won back.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know. And I also think it's although it is true that it is the institutions disseminating the ideology, it's also like social media. I feel like the way that most people are consuming it these days, it's in bite-sized form in like TikTok videos. And it's very hard to understand that there's machinations happening behind the scenes or larger powers at work. It feels like something small and authentic in your pocket, in that pocket of your hand, right?
But I want to hear your response to this, and I want to take a step back and give you more place to ask stuff that are not from my prayer book. But I don't like that framing of bigger forces at play, because there are bigger forces at play. Yeah. There are, because this is how geopolitics works. But the problem isn't the bigger forces. An educated reader can read and can study. There are choices about how you apply your intellectual faculties.
Yeah, but when like you said earlier, when the New York Times is putting out things that is incorrect, it's easy to make mistakes or to not be as educated as you.
I would suggest that if you can be skeptical but not conspiratorial, and when the Al-Ahli hospital event happened, I was going down the list. I was even texting with Kevin Williamson at the time, who was my colleague at the Dispatch, and we're texting about the hierarchy of possibility. And it was like, well, the likelihood of Israel intentionally bombing a hospital is like close to zero, as far as I understand. Could be, but I doubt it. More likely is that this was a mistake, or that there is something wrong and this is not actually Israeli action. But I had no reason to doubt the New York Times at that point, even though I've been at that point multiple times critical of the New York Times. I just didn't assume that they're going to make such a horrific blood libel of lying about Israel bombing a hospital and killing 300 people. Like, blatantly lying. This is the definition of a blood libel, right? Like, let's just be clear. This is like unequivocal blood libel. Because as it turned out, a few hours later, not only did Israel not bomb the hospital, but this was actually a failed missile launch from the Islamic Jihad, another faction, Islamic faction in Gaza, not Hamas. So it was a failed launch. that the Islamic Jihad did from the hospital. So this proves Israel's constant point that these are people that are launching attacks, military attacks from civilian infrastructure. So this is a failed launch from a hospital that ended up blowing up the hospital. So not only was it not Israel, but also turns out that it actually did not blow up the hospital. It blew up the parking lot. And not only did it not kill 300 people, it killed between 5 to 15 or maybe 30. I don't remember exactly what the final count was, but that was the actual range. It was. So the New York Times goes within 5 minutes with a headline saying, Israel bombed a hospital, killing 300 people. That is the New York Times headline. That is the Washington Post headline. That is the entire American Western media, BBC, Guardian, obviously. And within hours, it turns out, actually, it was the Islamic Jihad bombing from a hospital, launching a rocket from a hospital, landing in the parking lot, killing between 10 and 15 people. For me, if I'm a naive person who, for some reason, has no affinity to the region, doesn't understand the history of the Middle East, but really decides prompted by my favorite TikTok cooking influencer that I should really care about the Palestinian story, I see this and I get this headline, and within hours I'm told that this is the total inversion of the story. Me, Adam, I would have been like, I would take a pause. I would take a step back and say, like, something really is off about this. And the stories that I'm getting fed are at least askew. Okay? So I don't buy that story, that line of, how can you tell truth from fiction? How can you handle all this bombardment of social media? I mean, yeah, it is difficult, but that's me being a believer in the individual power of engaging with truth. I put the responsibility, the onus on you as a reader to not be an idiot.
No, I wouldn't. I mean, people, like, you're putting a lot of onus on, you said, like, on engagement. Most people are not actually engaged. They're just passively consuming, scrolling. Their understanding of this topic is vibey more than informed.
Okay, and that's why I shall call them morons.
Right, well, it goes back to what you were talking about before, which was that on October 8th, there was already a narrative that was constructed. And as someone who's like in the academy, well, I was in the jungle in the Amazon actually, but I was on my computer engaging with academics in the belly of the beast of anti-Zionist ideology.
Oh, at first I thought you said metaphorically you were in the jungle of academia.
No, I was actually in the Amazon. Yeah. I was doing my PhD research with an indigenous tribe in the Amazon, and I'd been in their village without any internet or phone for around 3 months, and I returned to a local town still in the Amazon. I arrived on October 9th, opened my computer. The first thing I saw was images from the Nova Festival. Second thing I saw was these left academics, basically calling me a Zionist and saying a lot of offensive things. So, but as someone who saw that from the belly of the beast.
And feeling exhilarated. I think exhilarated was the word of the academics responding to October 7th.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Exhilarated.
And I saw the entire narrative already there. I think that's actually what kept me sane at one level through the sort of gradual escalation that we saw, where all the accusations within the mainstream media kept escalating, and eventually the genocide libel was mainstreamed in the New York Times and became sort of almost a kind of cultural consensus. So the fact that I saw that already on October 8th is why, like, when I see people who sort of came to the conclusion, so to speak, 2 years later that Israel was doing a genocide, I obviously don't buy it, because the priors were already there. It was a narrative that was pre-constructed that they just pushed into the mainstream. And it's those priors that determine how people evaluate information, right? And it's those priors that determine how these journalists are choosing to circulate, non-credible.
Choosing? I did a Woody Allen.
They have the option not to do so, and they're choosing to circulate non-credible information because it it confirms pre-existing beliefs. So the element of constructing Israel as the symbolic scapegoat of all evil in the world itself structures how people circulate information about the war and what they show and what they don't.
Yeah, but this doesn't actually answer Vanessa's concern about the naive. I call it moron. She calls it innocent.
Innocent or not, it's both.
Yeah,
it's,
sure.
The gambit, but
but you're already receiving the narrative at that point.
Yes, you're receiving it in bite-sized
every
form.
single day. It's just Israel kills 15 Palestinians. Israel bombed like a Red Cross car, and you never see a single picture of Hamas fighting out of a building.
So but you're supporting Vanessa's point. Just let's be clear. Like your idea of being bombarded by this information will turn you into, you being a Westerner that believes in people being happy and merry and is kind of like a little bit influenced by the academic mindset that views indigeneity this is the racist core of Western academia that has, supplanted the primacy of Western culture with the primacy of quote unquote indigenous culture. But how they view Western culture and how they view indigenous culture still hews the line of 19th century European racism, with European superpowers being the only agents in the story and quote unquote indigenous populations being those, soulful, tribal, innocent creatures dancing naked under the sun with nothing but communism between them, nothing, no sense of private property or violence until the evil foreigner comes in and imposes their system. It's the same model as this is literally European 19th century morality and ethnography, only inverted. This is not humanizing the colonized. This is just inverting the moral priority. But what you're saying is that somebody who was raised on these views in academia, in the ambient Western media sphere, being exposed to the pictures that show up on Instagram, on TikTok, on social media, and consuming them uncritically, will inevitably become an anti-Zionist because they just see that as the only logical moral conclusion to the images that they are exposed to. To which I say, no. I believe that people can be not idiots. I don't buy that people, just by sheer exposure to propaganda and narrow narration, become idiots. I have grown in a specific society with a specific culture, and when exposed to narratives that don't agree with me, I have thought through those narratives, and that is why I can probably represent the Palestinian perspective more thoroughly and carefully than any leftist that you will pluck, than Zohran Mamdani. I probably understand Palestinian society way more than Brother Zohran. So the idea that being raised in one environment makes you incapable of recognizing the propaganda of your own environment or being critical of it is insane to me. No, this is total abdication of responsibility of readers. We had a conversation a few months ago hosted in this home where we brought people that we like to give to present a lecture on a topic, basically a TED talk on a topic that they cared about. And one of those friends had a thesis. She said, she's a literary scholar, and she said that Shakespeare deserves better readers. And I feel the same about geopolitics and the Middle East. The Middle East deserves better participants, better like external participant, commentators, readers. Like the reader should be responsible for their own idiotic interpretation of events. And if you are such a reader who, by exposure to a few cooking influencers telling you how to think about Gaza, become an anti-Zionist, then no, I do not excuse it. I do not say, oh, you're the victim of TikTok propaganda. You are an idiot.
But this is how libels work, right? Because all libels are actually possible claims. So sometimes you hear this conversation, right? Someone might be like, oh, you think Israel's doing a genocide? That's anti-Semitic. And the other person says, well, Israel could be doing a genocide. So, it's just a critique, right? But, all libels are possible claims. So if someone's giving you a narrative that there's no other side at all, Hamas doesn't even exist, Israel is just randomly bombing children, right? Like I feel like what you're saying is like, oh no, I'd recognize that that's ridiculous, but it is possible, right? Like there have been genocides, in Rwanda there was a genocide. They actually just tried to murder everyone, right? And in the Holocaust it was a genocide. They just tried to murder everyone.
Yeah,
so
but
that could happen.
No,
right?
but no, because obviously genocides happen, but in no other genocide has the entire nation, including most of its leadership, not all of it. Granted, again, we have the Smotrichs and the Ben-Gvirs. Mind you also that every time that somebody wants to caveat the evil face of Israel, they mention two ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. There are two others that I can name that are equally evil, but there are like 2 to 4 people that you mention among 120 Israeli ministers, Israeli members of parliament, who are recognizably evil. Because, those are the people, and their actual influence on this is close to zero, if not actual zero. They do have some influence, I would say, on the permission structure in the West Bank. This is for the nuance. But certainly in the war in Gaza and the quote-unquote genocide, they have zero influence on what's happening in Gaza. And those are the same two people, the same morons that other morons point to and blame. Look, Israel is admitting it. They want to commit genocide. No, those two assholes say that they want to commit genocide or use genocidal language. But the actual policy from the military elite, from Netanyahu, from everybody else who actually has power in Israel, not to mention the entire Israel media ecosystem and the entire Israel, the majority of the Israeli population, are very clear about their desire to resolve this with minimal harm to Palestinians. And no other genocidal culture that you've mentioned, not in Rwanda, certainly not in Germany, not in Nanping during the Japanese rape of Nanping. None of these places did you have the supposedly genocide committing population going out every weekend protesting and to stop the war, and mostly like raising pictures of dead innocent civilians in Gaza in support of the plight and in solidarity with the plight of the people being under attack by their own government. Like, what are you talking about? Of course, this is not a genocide. Of course, this is not a genocidal population. This is a very brutal war in an ugly situation constructed by Hamas. But I understand if the idea of a terrorist organization that hijacked a society with its death cult ideology and engineering this scenario with the destruction of its own population being a little bit complicated for the person who got introduced into the Middle East through cooking TikTok. I understand that they might not follow all these nuances, but at the same time, if you're talking about there has been genocides in history, whenever in these instances do you see such solidarity with the Arab population, with the Palestinian population in the supposed genociding society?
Of course, I mean, there's so many anomalies that make this not look like
absurd
a genocide. But of course, the public has been...
Including the fact that it's not a genocide.
Yeah.
By the definition of genocide being that the genocide is intentional with the goal of destroying a nation, which is not what this is.
Essentially murdering all the people.
No, not necessarily murdering all the people. Genocide is not defined by the numbers of people that you kill. It is defined by the intent to destroy the nation. You can destroy a nation with killing minimal numbers if you have diffused the national aspirations of the people. I would argue that anti-Zionism is a genocidal mission.
That gets a bit more complicated because the Genocide Convention is focused on on physical murder, and most of the paradigmatic cases are focused on that. But Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish jurist who came up with the concept of genocide, he was interested in the concept of cultural genocide, right? And that's actually what a lot of these academics are working with. They look at indigenous cultures, and so they really broaden the concept of genocide. B'Tselem tried to argue that we should go back to Lemkin's concept of a cultural genocide, since there were a lot of schools and stuff that were destroyed. But that still comes back to the question of intent, because they weren't trying to
and going back to the
Palestinian
point,
culture.
this is B'Tselem. This is an Israeli organization. This is an Israeli organization that is trying to expand, redefine the terms of genocide in order to make Israel under Netanyahu more culpable to that definition.
And this is where the public has been lied to, is that these organizations have presented themselves to the public as if they found Israel guilty of genocide under the Genocide Convention by law. That is not what any of these organizations have done. They've all used trendy academic theories like settler colonial theory that redefine, that expand the concept of genocide, that say that Israel has always been genocidal. It's been doing a genocide since 1948. So they have not conveyed this to the public. So there's this guy, Dirk Moses. He runs the Journal of Genocide Research. He's one of the most influential thinkers within this sort of small cabal of genocide scholars, who are the same ones influencing, the way Amnesty International writes. They're in close contact with Francesca Albanese, for example.
Francesca Albanese is a UN. What is her station exactly?
She was the special rapporteur to the Palestinian territories.
Yeah, and she is a rabid anti-Zionist. If you know her, you know her.
She's unlike any other UN official we've ever seen, because she's a kind of celebrity. She's an activist. The way she talks and engages is very, inflammatory. She doesn't even attempt to seem neutral in any respect.
No, and go on.
So basically, this guy, Dirk Moses, he's really one of the most influential theorists, and his view is actually that we shouldn't use the concept of genocide at all, and that we should get rid of the concept of genocidal intent. So he says, what does it matter to a civilian if they're murdered by military intent, that is someone trying to legitimately kill an enemy like Hamas, but with casualties, or if they're murdered by genocidal intent, like someone actually trying to just kill civilians. And I think that statement, which is at the very beginning of his book, Permanent Security, is so indicative of the kind of thinking that's taking place in academia around genocide, because it sounds moral at first, and because it puts the victim's perspective at the forefront, because it's kind of true. I mean, if I was just like bombed, it wouldn't really matter to me if that was as part of a genocide, or if it was because I lived in the same house as a terrorist. But obviously from a moral and legal perspective, it's completely absurd, because crime is all about the intent and the responsibility and the agency of actors involved.
And it's doubly absurd because the whole reason why we have international law, flawed concept though it is in order to create the distinction under which violent engagement is legitimate. Of course, in any kind of violent engagement, people are going to die, and for the people who die, it doesn't matter why they died, it sucks that they died. The whole reason why international law exists is to say there are certain circumstances in which this violence is more legitimate than others. Not to say that we lack empathy for anybody who is murdered or is killed, or whatever the legal category you want to place it in. Whoever finds themselves dead or maimed under a military attack is a victim of pain and suffering that we can feel a lot of empathy for. However, we understand as humanity that there needs to be some boundaries between different types of violent engagement. That's why we have laws of war. That's why we have this category of genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes, to recognize that there are lines beyond which the behavior should be considered illegitimate. And for somebody to say, well, we should just put away with this because really this pain and suffering of humanity, the heart cries for the heavens cry for the dead infants that litter the streets. Like, sure, that's a beautiful sentiment. Are you saying that we should enforce pacifism and there should be no war? That's great. Great. Please write down on your tablets, thou shalt not commit war.
Well, that was like the Pope. Right? The recent Pope, the war in Gaza was still going on. And of course, as the Pope, he had to have some generic condemnation of Israel, both because he's part of the kind of international anti-Zionist complex with a lot of connections to the UN, and also because he's the Pope, right, and the Catholic Church. And
it's on brand.
What would they do without Jew hatred? So, but he was like, he literally quoted that, thou shalt not kill, from the Bible. And people were responding, well, you know, I didn't expect the Pope to misquote the Ten Commandments, but he literally just did.
And to be clear, because the Ten Commandments, the Hebrew actually says, thou shalt not murder, now, which is already a legal distinction between different types of killing.
Right.
Right, which is obvious in the Hebrew Bible because the Hebrew Bible clearly allows for acts of self-defense
and war,
and potentially also maybe aggressive war. We don't have to go into that.
Yes.
But there are the point is whether or not we accept the moral and legal distinctions based in like a literal reading of the Hebrew Bible, there are such distinctions.
No, but without even going to dopey, dopey college room conversations about pacifism, it should be obvious that even if you want to impose your thou shalt not commit war, who is enforcing it? And by what means?
Yeah, so Dirk Moses, for example, and Martin Shaw is another one of these so-called genocide scholars who are spreading the genocide libel. They basically say that the concept of civilian casualties, which is a basic part of international law of armed conflicts, is inherently wrong. They say there's basically just a scale, it's a question of degree between genocide and war with a lot of casualties, right? So they think that when lots of people die as casualties, it's essentially just become a method for these evil Western states to get away with genocide. But that's obviously kind of an absurd and uncharitable way of looking at war. It's basically saying, I already know...
Forget about uncharitable, unrealistic.
But it's also saying, I already know you have some evil intent and you're hiding something.
No, I think it's saying, to be charitable with that interpretation, it's saying that your intent doesn't matter. And the very fact that you're harming civilians is, regardless of your intent, condemnable. And I would say, there's a moral justification for this view. I don't want innocent civilians to die in warfare. The realities of warfare, especially urban warfare, when you have a terrorist organization hiding behind urban civilians, but any kind of warfare is going to lead to casualties who are not combatants. So the question is only how to distinguish between them. Because otherwise, if you're going to say we're going to compose a Kantian universal imperative that says you cannot kill civilians on any conditions, and therefore you are not allowed to conduct any kind of warfare if there's a chance of you hitting civilian populations, then you're just going to be destroyed by your enemies who does not follow by those rules.
Of course. And in practice, that's what it is. You support the kind of Islamists or terrorists who are waging violence. Or
Putinists.
Yeah, exactly. Or waging violence against Western democracies who follow international law, because you're spending all your time condemning those democracies and saying international law is fake while you're turning a blind eye to people who are quite comfortable with committing atrocities. But on this question of intent, it's also really interesting Amnesty International's report, which of course, not many people read, but it instantly gives some kind of authority to the claim. I think that we should...
What did it say?
So it talks about dual intent. So they actually created this new concept. So all of these different genocide libelers try and come up with a new concept, basically, which is basically their way.
How can we redefine genocide in order to include what Israel is doing in Gaza?
Exactly, and that drives a lot of creativity to try and to try and make a label fit something that's not actually happening. So dual intent, they said,
and also it should be clear just before you describe the amnesty attempt, that the reason that it doesn't fit is not only because Israel doesn't want to commit genocide, but Israel is actually incredibly careful with regards to international law. Israel literally has a battery of international lawyers observing any military decision. That's why I found it so unlikely that Israel just bombed a hospital to kill 300 people. It was not because I think that the Israeli government is so morally advanced, but I just know that as a matter of practice, the IDF is constrained, or at least in constant conversation with international lawyers who try to make sure that any decision the IDF makes, no matter how brutal or destructive it may seem, is in comportment with international law.
Right. And so that's also what a lot of these reports and stuff are trying to deal with. Some of them know, Dirk Moses knows as well, that many of these actions might be in accord with international law. And so they need to create this bizarre concept of genocide where a country is actually, maybe largely following international law. I'm not going to say that Israel always was following international law. Certainly does not. And there's definitely a lot of individual war crimes that took place.
Well, individual war crimes aside, that's the nature of war.
Right. But in any case, they're trying to make a conceptual framework in which you can follow international law completely and somehow still commit a genocide, which is clearly absurd under the actual current legal structure of these crimes.
And if law is to mean anything, it means that you're working within a framework that is mutually agreed upon. Otherwise, it's not a law. Otherwise, you're just changing the game.
Right, exactly. That's basically the totalitarianism.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's arbitrariness.
A small group of people who take over and redefine what all the laws and the words mean, and you start living in an Orwellian universe.
Okay, so just go back to dual intent.
Okay. So dual intent is basically how they try and solve this problem of a state following international law but committing a genocide. So they try and claim actually that Israel somehow has two different intents, right? One is the intent to target and defeat Hamas. One is and then the other, is to kill the entire population of Gaza. If you think about this concept, it doesn't make any sense. And I've never seen anyone be able to explain it to me. So Amnesty International used this new concept that makes no sense because it's actually just contradictory. Let's say Israel does a strike on a Hamas base and a bunch of civilians die. In what sense is there dual intent, right? Either that was a strike that was targeting Hamas or it was targeting civilians. If it was targeting civilians, that's just genocidal intent. If it was targeting Hamas, that is military intent, and it should be understood in terms of proportionality, right? So were too many civilians killed for such an attack?
Right. Proportionality being not whether you've harmed more or whether you've caused proportional harm to your enemy that they have committed to you, but rather did the collateral damage caused by your attack, was the collateral damage caused by your attack justified by the value of succeeding in the attack? Meaning that, was this such a high-level military target that had such high value that it justified a certain amount of civilian casualties, and missing that attack would have prolonged the war longer, which would have caused more deaths in the long run? That is the fundamental logic of proportionality.
Right. And so if you look at actual strikes, it doesn't make sense to say that they have dual intent. They either have one or the other. But what they're trying to say is that Israel is doing these strikes on Hamas, but they really secretly want to kill as many civilians as possible. But we want to make it appear that they're targeting Hamas. That's absurd. You can't prove that.
It's sneaky intent. It's not dual. It's sneaky intent.
And it's not actually dual intent.
Sneaky Jewy intent.
It's really just saying that one intent is fake and the other is not. Yeah.
All right. Well, so as we start to wrap up this conversation, I do want to ask you, kind of a little bit looping back to the beginning of our conversation and the normalization of anti-Zionism. To how close is the U.S., do you think, to having anti-Zionism just be a standard view? Do you think that the pendulum will swing back and this is just a phase and an era, or is this the beginning of a new acceptance
So I think on the left and in the Democratic Party, anti-Zionism is the standard view. I mean, most people on the left and, within the Democratic Party establishment no longer view Zionism as anything positive. I think that word only has negative associations. I don't think anyone who identifies as a Zionist sort of has any right to be in the Democratic Party today. So it's been normalized. And on the right, we're seeing obviously the rise of right-wing anti-Zionism with Tucker Carlson, and then also with his own anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And we have people like Nick Fuentes, who's more of like a classical anti-Semite neo-Nazi, but who have been emboldened by the post-October 7th Gaza genocide, libel, and hysteria. So anti-Zionism on the left worked to actually aid anti-Semitism on the right, in my opinion.
I would say that the Fuentes type of anti-Zionism anti-Semitism is clearly emulating some of the elements of the anti-Zionism of the left. But again, I actually agree with you on there being no distinction between the two. I've been trying to challenge this idea, but I think it's so obviously correct, with the exception of the Jewish anti-Zionists that are, and we're talking about the Satmar and a specific religious cult that are a fringe in Judaism, who call themselves the Jewish anti-Zionists and have nothing to do with our discussion. But they are people who this is a specific fringe group of Judaism that believes that basically we need the full proper messianic theocracy building the third temple, and before that, no other state is legitimate. So that kind of anti-Zionism is indeed Jewish, is part of the Jewish narrative, and is very fringe and bizarre and has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So let's put that aside. Other than that, all kinds of Zionism, even when they're held by Upper West Side Jews, are, I think, categorically buying into the Jewish hatreds. And
all kinds of anti-Zionism?
All kinds of anti-Zionism, I think, are buying into Jewish hatreds, even when they are promulgated by Upper West Side Jews. Again, I said except for the Satmar types, which are bizarre theological.
Yeah, but I'm actually not going to let them off the hook anymore. Like I would have let them off the hook. I would have let them just kind of live amongst themselves and believe this stuff. But now they're trying to, legitimize Mamdani. So,
but they've legitimized. Forget about Mamdani. They've legitimized Iran. They've legitimized.
Well, that's more Neturei Karta.
Neturei Karta, but yeah. But
Satmar was a bit less political in that sense.
Yeah, but I think they're the same. It's the same creed, and this is the same. They feel disconnected from the secular Jewish identity at large. They see them, so they certainly won't recognize anybody in the Upper West Side as fellow Jew. But my point is that we have not discussed indigeneity. We've mentioned it in passing, but we've not discussed indigeneity, and I think that's good because I think the whole concept is bunk and bullshit. But I think that I've said this many times, that the people on the left that have decided all of a sudden that indigeneity is the nerve center of colonial, to judge the colonial versus the authentic self, is bullshit. But if you're going to play this game, I'm going to win when it comes to Israel. Like, Israel wins the indigeneity game if you want to play that game, but I don't want to play the game because I think all of indigeneity is just such false bullcrap science. Like, there's no such thing. There's no people that belong to a land. The Jews tell a story about the land. So if you want to talk about indigeneity, yeah, my entire Jewish identity is formed around the land of Israel for 3,000 years. So there's no more indigenous shit than this. But I think indigeneity is bullshit. So I'm glad that we didn't go into this, even though that Adam can wax poetic on this. But I want to end on the final question. How do you define if anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism, is a form of Jewish hate, if they were all part of the same thing, the same quality, the same pattern in the human heart, what is it? How do you define it? Whether it's anti-Semitism, Jewish hate, or anti-Zionism, what is your single definition to this phenomenon?
Well, I'm just gonna nuance it slightly. So anti-Zionism is definitely Jew hate. No question. But it is different than classical anti-Semitism. It has its own new libels like the colonizer, apartheid, and genocide libels, like we've been talking about, that have mutated. And it even has some functional differences, I think. So classical anti-Semitism was really about Jewish assimilation. It was against Jews assimilating into nation states. Anti-Zionism is actually, at least superficially, good with Jewish assimilation. It wants Jews to assimilate into nation states. It doesn't like that Jews have their own sort of enclave or ghetto and nation state today. And the way it targets Jews is different. It's more collective. It's about the Jewish nation and the Jewish people. And it has that space for these token Jews, these individual anti-Zionist Jews who separate themselves from the Jewish collective. And so it functions in this kind of new way through marking people as Zionists, which aren't sort of the exact same thing as Jews, right? And that's kind of the power of anti-Zionism today, to say it's not anti-Semitism. And at some level, it's true as long as we think of anti-Semitism like classical anti-Semitism, and we don't recognize the anti-Zionism's its own form of Jew hate today.
So you don't. I expected you to take something like, or a version of Dara Horn's the definition of this, which I'm sure you've heard, which I think this is fantastic. Which is just it's the Jewish hate of whatever stage you want to look at is to say that. I mean, some say that it's about double standards, which I think is a fair definition. Double standard. Everybody gets to have a nation state except for the Jews. Everybody gets to have a state where they're an ethno-identifying state except for the Jews. So you can be a Pakistani ethno-religious state, but the Jews don't get to do that. That's Mamdani's position. So that's anti-Semitic. The double standard. That's a fair trick. I like Dara Horn's definition, which is that somehow the Jew is the only thing standing between you and the thing you want.
Right. I think that goes back to this symbolic scapegoating. It's constructing Israel as kind of, the last evil entity before revelation. But that is specific to anti-Zionism.
No, because you find the same. You
find the same throughout. But the target here is Israel.
Right.
There's a lot of attempt to say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism because it's really talking about all Jews. Well, anti-Zionism really is a hatred of Israel.
Right. It's the self-determined Jew. That is the problem in this case, right? Yeah. It's not all the Jews. If the Jew are scattered and weaken my minority, that's fine. But the self-determined Jew is the thing.
The inglorious bastard Jew.
The inglorious bastard Jew, exactly. Well, we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.